Her hands would not stop trembling as the stagecoach rattled the last mile toward Stony Creek, and Mira Ashworth pressed them flat against her skirt to still them, though nothing could still the dread sitting cold in her stomach. Somewhere ahead waited a rancher named Wendell Stone, a man who had spent 6 months exchanging letters with a woman he believed to be her sister Vivien, and who was about to discover, at the depot, in front of whatever curious townsfolk had gathered to watch the bride arrive, that the family had sent him the wrong one entirely. It had not been Mira's idea. Nothing in her life ever seemed to be. When Vivien had refused at the last hour to board the train west, weeping that she would rather die an old maid in comfort than marry a stranger in some god-forsaken cattle country, their mother had turned without hesitation to Mira, standing in the parlor doorway with the trunk already half-packed for a sister who was refusing to use it. "You'll go instead," she'd said, as though it settled itself, as though Mira's entire future were a minor inconvenience to be reassigned like a chore left undone. "He's paid for a bride, and a bride he'll have, and it hardly matters which Ashworth girl steps off that train, does it, since you were never going to find a husband any other way." Her father had not even looked up from his newspaper to object. Her younger brothers had laughed, not unkindly, but not kindly either, the way families laugh at truths too old and too worn to feel cruel anymore simply from repetition. Mira had stood very still in that parlor and understood, with a clarity that still ached 3 weeks later on this rattling coach, that her entire family had spent 24 years quietly agreeing she was the daughter easiest to spend, and none of them had thought to ask her how that felt, because none of them imagined it might feel like anything at all. Mira had heard variations of that sentence her whole life. Vivien was the pretty one, the clever one, the one worth the trouble of a proper courtship. Mira was the one who kept the household ledgers, mended the good dresses, though no one in the family seemed to remember this particular fact, had written every single one of the letters that had won Wendell Stone's heart, because Vivien found correspondence tedious and had simply told Mira what sentiment to convey and let her sister's pen do the rest. Mira had poured 6 months of her own true thoughts into those pages under her sister's name, and now she was riding toward the man who had fallen for those very words, wearing a face he had never seen and did not expect. The coach rolled to a stop in a town smaller and dustier than she'd imagined. A scatter of clapboard buildings beneath a sky so wide it made her chest ache, and there, waiting at the depot rail, stood a tall man in a clean but well-worn coat, hat in his hands, clearly dressed for an occasion he had thought through carefully. He was younger than she'd pictured, weathered by sun and work, but not unhandsome, and his eyes, when the coach door opened, went first with open hope to the woman who stepped down after Mira, an older passenger, a stranger entirely, before finding Mira last, and going unmistakably uncertain. Miss Ashworth. His gaze swept her plain grey travelling dress, her ordinary brown hair pinned without fuss, her face that had never once in 24 years been called beautiful by anyone who did not first apologize for the compliment being small. She watched him search for the woman in the photograph her mother had sent, the photograph of Vivien in her Sunday best, and watched the exact moment he understood there had been some manner of substitution. "I'm Mira," she said, chin lifted though her whole body wanted to fold inward. Vivien's sister. There was no gentle way to say it, so she chose the honest one instead. She decided against the marriage. "My family sent me in her place, and I understand if that is unacceptable to you, Mr. Stone. I can take the next coach back east, and no one need think worse of you for it." Around them, several townsfolk who had gathered out of ordinary curiosity had gone very still, clearly sensing a scene. And Mira felt her face heat with particular humiliation of being discussed as a disappointing substitution in front of strangers, exactly as she had been discussed her whole life within the walls of her own home. Wendell Stone was quiet a long moment, studying her with an attention that unsettled her more than outright rejection would have. "You wrote to me," he said finally. "It was not quite a question. I beg your pardon? The letters. All of them. There was a turn of phrase in the third one you sent about the cottonwoods along the river turning gold in autumn, reminding you of your grandmother's hands, and I asked after it directly in my next letter, curious where such a thought came from, and the answer that came back was clumsy, evasive. Nothing like the woman who wrote the rest." He tilted his head slightly. I've spent 6 months falling for a woman's mind, Miss Ashworth, and I've had a suspicion these last 2 months that the mind and the name on the envelope weren't rightly matched. Was it you? All of it? Mira's throat tightened. No one had ever asked her that question, had ever seemed to care which words in a letter, a room, a family conversation, had actually originated with her rather than being credited elsewhere. Yes, she admitted quietly. Every word was mine. Vivien only told me what to say in the first letter, and after that I simply wrote what I thought and signed her name, because that was what was asked of me. Then it seems, Wendell said, and something had shifted in his expression, something warm working its way up through the surprise, that the woman I've been corresponding with for half a year is standing right in front of me after all, and the only substitution made was in the signature. A ripple of murmurs moved through the small crowd at the depot, curious and not entirely kind, and Mira heard, distinctly, a woman's voice mutter something about the Ashworths trying to pass off their plain daughter on an unsuspecting rancher, and felt the old familiar shame rise hot in her chest. The shame of being found wanting simply by existing in the shadow of a prettier sister. Wendell heard it too. He turned, unhurried, toward the small knot of onlookers, and his voice, when he spoke, carried clear and level across the whole depot yard. "I'll thank you all to remember," he said, "that I wrote to a woman for 6 months not knowing what she looked like, and every letter she sent taught me something worth knowing about her character, her patience, her humor, the plain unflinching way she tells the truth, even when a prettier lie would serve her better. I did not order a face out of a catalogue. I asked for a wife with sense and steadiness, and it appears Gore fit to send me exactly that, however her family managed the delivery." He looked back at Mira, and the warmth in his gaze was steady enough that she believed, for the first time in her life, that someone might actually mean it. "If you'll still have me, Miss Ashworth, I'd be glad to marry the woman who wrote those letters, plain dress and all, and I'll consider myself the luckier man for the family's mistake, since it seems they sent me the better sister without ever meaning to." Mira felt tears rise, unbidden and entirely unfamiliar, because she had cried plenty in her life over being overlooked, but almost never over being chosen. "You don't know me beyond paper and ink," she managed. "I might disappoint you in the flesh." "You've disappointed no one today but a handful of gossips who came expecting a prettier show," Wendell said. "I'd rather build a life with the woman who wrote me true things than the one who couldn't be troubled to write at all." They were married within the week. In a small ceremony at the Stony Creek church that half the curious town attended, less out of goodwill than a hunger to see how the substituted bride's story would end, and Mira walked down the short aisle with her chin high and Wendell's steady gaze fixed on her the entire way, as though there were no one else worth looking at in the room. In the weeks that followed, she found herself, for the first time in her life, waking each morning without dread, learning the rhythms of the ranch, the names of the hands, the particular contented quiet of a house where her opinion was asked, and genuinely rather than merely tolerated. Wendell read her letters aloud sometimes in the evenings, the old ones she had written under Vivien's name, and told her which lines he had read over and over on lonely nights before she arrived. And each time it struck her fresh that the words which had once been dismissed inside her own home as a chore for Vivien's benefit had been, all along, quietly building the very life she now stood inside of. The true test came at the autumn harvest social, 6 weeks into her marriage, when a hired coach rolled unannounced into Stony Creek and Vivien herself stepped down from it, dressed in traveling silk far too fine for the dusty street. Having heard through their mother's letters that the rancher Mira married was doing rather better for himself than anyone in the family had first assumed, she found her way to the social hall that same evening, sweeping in on the arm of no one, and made directly for Wendell with the easy confidence of a woman who had never once in her life doubted her own welcome. "Mr. Stone," Vivien said, all warmth and practiced charm, "I do hope there are no hard feelings over the confusion. I was terribly unwell when the time came to travel, or I should certainly have come myself. I'd love the chance to properly make your acquaintance, now that I find myself passing through." The hall had gone quiet in the particular way a room does when it senses a story about to gain a second chapter. half the town's eyes sliding toward Mira to see how she would bear the sight of her sister, radiant and unbothered, reaching for the very life that had once been intended for her. Mira felt the old cold reflex rise in her chest, the instinct to shrink, to apologize for taking up space that had originally been earmarked for someone prettier. She did not shrink. "Vivien," she said instead, stepping forward, steady, "it's good to see you well. You'll forgive me if I don't offer you my husband's acquaintance twice, though you had every chance to make it yourself. 6 months of letters and a train ticket besides, and you chose comfort over the trouble of it. I won't fault you for that choice. I only ask you not mistake my life now for something you're owed a claim on." Wendell stepped to Mira's side without hesitation, his hand finding hers, and addressed Vivien directly with the same plain, unhurried courtesy he'd shown a crowd of strangers at the depot months before. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "I wish you well, truly. But I married the sister who wrote me the truth for 6 months running, and stood in a depot yard and told a whole town the truth again, rather than run from it. There's no confusion left to clear up here." He did not raise his voice, and he did not need to. The room had already drawn its own conclusion, and Vivien, finding no audience left inclined to pity her, made her excuses and departed before the evening's music had even properly begun. It took the better part of that first autumn for the whispers around Stony Creek to fully quiet, for the story of the substituted bride to stop being the choicest gossip at the mercantile counter, but Wendell never once let Mira feel the sting of it alone. He introduced her at church and at market as his wife with a pride so plain and unhurried that even the sharpest tongues eventually found it dull sport to keep needling a man so evidently, stubbornly happy, when her mother wrote, months later, some brittle letter, half apology and half request for a loan against Mira's apparent good fortune. Mira read it once, folded it neatly, and set it aside without the old ache she once would have felt, 'cause she had finally learned, standing beside him, a man who had chosen her plainly and on purpose, that being second in her family's eyes had never once meant being second in anyone else's. By the time the cottonwoods along the Stony Creek turned gold that first autumn together, exactly as she had once described them in a letter she never expected anyone to truly read, Mira stood on the porch of her own home beside a husband who watched the color change with the same quiet wonder she felt herself, and understood, at last and completely, what it was to be the one someone chose.